When winter came and frosty winds cut through their bones, medieval peasants had to rely not on modern heating technologies or fashionable lightweight down jackets, but solely on their ingenuity, knowledge of nature, and the limited resources available to them. How did they manage to keep from freezing to death by doing daily grueling work in the snow-covered fields, tending cattle in coal barns, or working around the house when the temperature dropped to unimaginable levels and snow could cover everything for months? It was a world without central heating, without thermal underwear, and without pharmacies offering frostbite remedies. Are you ready to dive into the atmosphere of a medieval winter and find out what ancient but surprisingly effective secrets allowed them to retain vital warmth and functionality, despite the harsh realities of severe cold weather and the almost complete absence of modern technology? Watch this video to the end to discover the secrets of their amazing tolerance, pragmatism, and extraordinary ingenuity. Medieval peasants did not have the opportunity to purchase warm and light modern clothing, such as down jackets or synthetic insulation materials. Therefore, their main and, in fact, only effective strategy was multi-layered dressing. This meant wearing several layers of clothing, one on top of the other, which created a lot of air layers. These layers acted as natural, highly effective insulation, slowing down heat loss from the body. The air trapped between the layers of fabric has become an excellent heat insulator, since it does not conduct heat well. The more such air pockets, the more efficiently heat was stored, creating a kind of air cushion around the body. It was an intuitive but ingenious solution that allowed us to survive in conditions of constant cold and dampness, when maintaining the internal body temperature was critical. Nagoloyatela Nadivalis, a linen undershirt, camisa, was worn on the naked body light, relatively breathable, and able to absorb and remove moisture, sweat from the body, preventing hypothermia. Flax, though not as warm as wool, was pleasant to the body, dried quickly, and was relatively easy to access, as it was grown ubiquitously. It served as a kind of barrier between the skin and the coarser outer layers, preventing chafing and irritation from the coat. The undershirt also served the function of absorbing sweat, which was extremely important, since wet underwear quickly led to hypothermia. Regularly changing and washing, albeit infrequently, this particular layer was relatively easier than washing all the layered clothing. Over the linen shirt was a thicker, often woolen tunic that reached to the knees or mid-thigh. This was the main layer providing heat. Wool, due to its natural properties, was an ideal material for this layer. Then another tunic could be worn, or a large outer shirt made of thick, coarse wool. These additional layers increased the number of air layers and consequently the thermal insulation. Sometimes quilted vests or capes stuffed with wool or even dried leaves were used for extra warmth. The padding created additional volume and, consequently, more air pockets, significantly increasing the thermal insulation properties of clothing. Leaves and straw, though less effective and requiring frequent replacement, were extremely affordable and used in times of extreme need. This approach made it possible to adjust the body temperature depending on physical activity or changes in weather conditions. You could easily remove or add one of the layers. For example, remove the upper raincoat during intensive work, or conversely, put it on during rest. It was not just a matter of comfort, but a vital necessity to preserve precious warmth in conditions of constant cold, high humidity, and biting winds. Even a small temperature drop could be critical for a weakened body, and a cold could easily turn into a deadly disease. The lack of antibiotics and modern medicine made even the common cold a potentially deadly threat. This wise practice, by the way, remains relevant today for all those who work, play sports, or just spend a lot of time outdoors in cold weather, confirming its versatility and effectiveness. Farmers intuitively understood the laws of heat exchange long before their scientific discovery, based on centuries of experience and knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Their methods were simple but effective and proved viable in the harshest of environments. If in the Middle Ages there was a prize for the most versatile, useful, affordable, and vital material for clothing, it would undoubtedly be wool. It was the queen of all fabrics for peasant clothing and the absolute basis of their survival in winter. Wool was cut from their own sheep, which were bred in each farm. This was an integral part of a self-sufficient economy. Sheep breeding was widespread, since sheep produced not only wool, but also meat and milk, and their skins were used for leather and fur. This made them one of the most valuable livestock species for survival. This priceless material was then carefully spun by hand, using simple spinning wheels, and wove on primitive but surprisingly efficient home looms that were often passed down from generation to generation. The spinning process was labor-intensive and time-consuming, but it made it possible to turn raw wool into a strong and uniform thread. Weaving also required skill and patience. The result was a rough but incredibly warm, durable, wear-resistant, and, critically, naturally water-repellent cloth. Wool fibers, due to their unique structure, scales, perfectly retained air, creating air pockets, and had a unique property. They retained their insulating properties even in a wet state. This was vital in the often rainy, slushy, and foggy English winter, where precipitation was the norm rather than the exception. Unlike linen or cotton, which lose their thermal insulation properties and become cold when wet, wool continued to warm even when wet. This property is explained by the hygroscopicity of wool fibers, which are able to absorb moisture up to 30% of their own weight, while remaining dry to the touch and preserving air pockets. Also, wool has natural antibacterial properties, which helped reduce unpleasant odors, which was important given the rare washing. Almost all items of winter clothing were made from wool. Basic tunics, warm raincoats, often with hoods, simple trousers or chausses, stockings attached to the belt, hats, and even thick socks or leg wraps. The color of such clothing was usually natural. Various shades of gray, brown, beige, cream, or black, since persistent and bright dyes were very expensive, required complex technologies and additional resources that were inaccessible to the vast majority of peasants. Natural colors were also more practical, as they were less dirty and did not fade over time. Such exceptional functionality, ubiquitous availability, and relative cheapness, since it was produced internally, made wool absolutely irreplaceable. Without it, survival in the harsh and long medieval winters would have been virtually impossible, and deaths from hypothermia and cold-related illnesses would have increased dramatically. Wool wasn't just a material, it was a symbol of life and survival. But how did the peasants process this wool so that it was not too prickly and protected it from getting wet as effectively as possible, given the complete lack of modern technologies for processing fabrics and chemicals? The answer to this intriguing question will be found in the next section, where we will reveal the secrets of the ancient craft. The process of turning raw sheep's wool into a warm, relatively soft and wearable fabric was not just laborious, but a whole ritual that required considerable physical effort and time. It was a messy but absolutely vital stage in preparing for winter, ensuring the survival of the entire family. After shearing, the wool was first thoroughly washed in streams, barrels, or large vats to remove dirt, plant debris, dry leaves, and lanolin, fat, which, while giving the wool its natural water-repellent properties, made it sticky and difficult to process further. Washing was an important step, as clean wool was easier to handle further processing steps. Then it was combed with special combs or cards, untangling the fibers and leveling them, preparing for spinning. This process made the wool softer and fluffier, making it easier to form the thread. Carding also helped remove the remaining small debris particles. Women and girls often sat by the hearth on long winter evenings, when the day's work was done, and spun the threads for days on end with simple handheld spinning wheels and spindles, turning the plump wool into a strong thread. Spinning was an art passed down from mother to daughter, and the quality of the thread directly affected the strength and durability of the future fabric. These threads were then used to weave cloth on primitive but efficient hand looms, which were often installed directly in the peasant's home. Weaving was a time-consuming process that required attention and coordination. However, the true magic and the main secret of durability, water resistance, and high thermal insulation of woolen clothing were hidden in the process of felting or fulling. This step was critical, as it was the one that transformed the loose-woven fabric into a dense, almost impenetrable material. The cloth, woven from wool, was repeatedly soaked in hot water, then it was beaten, crushed and rubbed. This process was often carried out by feet in special wooden vats, or even in Wavern's small rivers, where the current drove special hammers, mechanizing the process. Although this was rare for most peasants who had to rely on manual labor. When felting, natural alkalis such as clay, fuller's earth, or wood ash could be added to the water, which helped to clean the wool, remove any remaining fat, and promote better fiber adhesion. The alkali helped to open the scales of wool fibers, which allowed them to better intertwine and interlock. This process led to an irreversible compaction of the wool fibers, which became entangled with each other, creating a dense, almost felt-like structure. As a result, the fabric became incredibly dense, warm, much more windproof, and, most importantly, significantly more water-repellent. After felting, the cloth became so dense that it could literally repel water, like a modern raincoat, and successfully protect it from torrential rain and biting wind. It has acquired properties similar to modern membrane fabrics, but without any chemical additives. It was this labor-intensive and seemingly simple process that gave medieval wool clothing its famous strength, exceptional durability, and outstanding insulation properties, making it a true shield against the harshest elements. Without this ancient knowledge and many hours of labor-intensive process, it would have been impossible to provide adequate protection from cold and moisture in the conditions of medieval winter, and the death rate would have been much higher. This demonstrates the amazing ingenuity and endurance of people who lived in that era, who, without modern technologies, found effective solutions for survival in extreme conditions. Although wool was the absolute basis of the peasant wardrobe, leather and fur also played an important role in winter clothing, although their use directly depended on the family's wealth and availability of resources. Leather elements, such as strong straps to support trousers or tunics, rough but hard-wearing leather boots or leg wraps, and gloves or leather-reinforced sections of clothing provided additional strength, durability, and protection from power. They were indispensable in hard physical labor, protecting the body from abrasions, cuts, and biting cold. Leather aprons, for example, were used by artisans to protect clothing and the body from sparks, dirt, and sharp tools. Leather was also used to make bags, purses, scabbards for tools and weapons, which emphasized its versatility and indispensability in everyday life. The strength of the leather made it an ideal material for creating objects that were subjected to constant stress and wear. In addition, leather products, unlike fabric products, had better resistance to abrasion and punctures, which was especially important when working with sharp objects or in rough terrain. Leather elements could also serve as a kind of barrier against bites on dead and small animals, which was relevant in rural areas. Fur, in the modern sense, was a real luxury for most peasants, but it was used when there was at least the slightest opportunity, especially for lining outerwear. For example, raincoats or jackets, or for making extra warm hats, mittens, and muffed. It was not the fur of valuable commercial animals, such as sable, ermine, or marten, which were available only to the nobility, but more common and affordable rabbit, fox, often obtained in traps, sheepskin after slaughtering old sheep, or even cats, which were obtained during hunting or breeding. The fur linings provided incomparable warmth and were as effective as possible at retaining air, creating the perfect thermal insulation layer. They not only warmed, but also protected from the wind, which was critical in open, drafty spaces. Fur was also used for finishing collars and cuffs, which not only added warmth, but also protected from snow and moisture inside the clothing. It is important to note that the use of fur was not only a matter of warmth, but also of status, although for peasants it was limited to the simplest and most accessible types. Sometimes fur was also used to make small pouches, or pouches for storing small items, while adding thermal insulation and softness to the contents. However, how did the peasants manage to process raw hides so that they did not rot, did not emit an unpleasant smell, and retain their thermal insulation properties, given the complete absence of modern tanning agents and preservatives? The answer lies in their ancient, sometimes very unpleasant, but effective knowledge, which we will discuss later. Processing raw animal skins in the Middle Ages was a dirty, time-consuming, and often unpleasant process, but without it, fur and leather would quickly deteriorate, becoming unusable. The peasants used primitive but surprisingly effective tanning methods based on centuries of experience passed down from generation to generation. Preparation of the skins began with a thorough cleaning of meat, fat, and subcutaneous layer residues using scrapers made of stone, bone, or strong wood. This stage, known as mezreni, was extremely important, as any remaining organic materials could cause rotting. Precision and thoroughness of mezrenia directly affected the quality of the final product and its durability. If this stage was performed poorly, the skin could be worn out even before tanning began. After fertilization, the skins were soaked in large vats or pits filled with solutions of plant components. The most common decoctions were made from the bark of oak, willow, or alder, as well as leaves and fruits of some plants containing tannins natural astringents. These tannins bound proteins in the skin, preventing rot, making it stronger, more flexible, and more resistant to moisture. The tanning process could take from several weeks to several months, depending on the thickness of the skin and the desired quality of the final product. The longer the skin was in the tanning solution, the denser and stronger the skin became, acquiring a characteristic color and aroma. Sometimes even animal urine or droppings were used for processing, which, although unpleasant and unsanitary to us, was very effective due to the ammonia contained in them and enzymes that helped break down fibers and soften the skin. This method, known as leavening, improved the skin's elasticity and made it easier to treat later. After fermentation, the skins were thoroughly washed to remove all residues and only then proceeded to tanning with tannins. This multi-step process, although primitive, allowed 4 striking results, turning raw material into valuable raw materials. It is important to note that each stage required a lot of physical labor and deep knowledge about the properties of the materials used. After tanning, the skins were stretched on frames and thoroughly air-dried. This step, known as drying and warming up, was important to prevent the skin from shrinking and hardening. The skins were regularly kneaded, stretched, and kneaded by hand to keep them soft and supple. They could then be lubricated with animal fat, wax, or fish oil to give them additional water-repellent properties and elasticity. Fat penetrated the skin fibers, creating a protective barrier against moisture and preventing it from drying out, which significantly extended the service life of the products. The fur was carefully combed and shaken out so that it did not stray and retained its fluffy properties. Sometimes the fur was fumigated with smoke from smoldering sawdust or herbs, which helped repel insects and gave it a pleasant smell. These methods made it possible to preserve the skins for a long time, turning them into a valuable resource for making winter clothing, shoes, and other household needs. Without this knowledge and skills, it would be impossible to provide yourself with warm and durable clothing that can withstand the harsh winters. Moreover, these methods allowed farmers to be self-sufficient in providing themselves with the necessary materials without relying on expensive purchased goods, which was critical for their survival. Protecting the head, hands, and feet was absolutely critical for survival in the cold, as it is through these parts of the body that the greatest heat loss occurs, as well as they are most susceptible to frostbite. In harsh winters, when low temperatures combined with high humidity and biting winds, and medical care was virtually unavailable, frostbite could lead to loss of limbs or even death. The headdresses of the peasants were diverse, but they all had one common goal: to preserve heat as efficiently as possible. These could be simple woolen hoods, often an integral part of outerwear, tunics or cloaks, or individual thick caps made of felted wool, sometimes lined with fur for extra warmth. Felted wool created a dense, windproof layer that was ideal for protection from the cold. These headwear not only kept you warm, but also effectively protected your face and neck from snow, rain, and biting wind, which could cause frostbite on exposed skin. In winter, farmers often also wore bandages covering their ears, or used face wraps to prevent frostbite on their cheeks and nose. Fur ear flaps or helmets that completely covered the head and ears were common in some regions, providing maximum isolation. Shoes were rough, but as functional and wear-resistant as possible. Wooden clogs on a thick, insulating sole from the cold ground, or simple leather shoes, often without lacing, which allowed them to be quickly put on and taken off. The simplicity of the shoe design made it easier to repair and maintain it in the absence of specialized workshops. The wooden soles effectively insulated the feet from the icy ground, preventing rapid cooling. Inside, the shoes could be plentifully lined with dry hay, straw, or moss to provide additional insulation and absorb the moisture that the feet inevitably released. These natural materials were readily available and changed regularly to maintain hygiene and warmth. Regularly changing the padding was key to maintaining dryness and preventing the development of fungi or other skin diseases. The feet were often wrapped in strips of thick cloth, windings, or thick woolen socks were worn, sometimes in several layers. The windings not only added warmth, but also provided additional support for the ankle joint, which was important when walking on uneven terrain for a long time and performing physical labor. These simple but carefully designed clothing elements were critical to preventing frostbite on the fingers, maintaining performance in conditions of constant cold and dampness, and protecting against colds that could become fatal. Without such protection, farmers would not be able to work in the fields and perform their daily duties, which would lead to starvation and extinction. How did they cope with the constant humidity and dirt that inevitably permeated the shoes, given the lack of waterproof materials and electric dryers? If you want to learn about their tricks and methods of keeping your feet warm, watch this video to the end. Constant humidity, mud, and slush were an integral part of the medieval peasant's life, especially in winter. Clothing, and especially shoes, were constantly getting wet, dirty, and heavy, which not only caused discomfort, but also significantly increased the risk of hypothermia and serious illnesses. In addition to the natural water-repellent properties of wool and specially treated leather, the peasants used simple but surprisingly effective methods to combat moisture based on best practices and a deep understanding of natural materials. Wet clothes and shoes were carefully dried by a constantly burning hearth or stove in a peasant's house. An open fire in the heat of the stove created the necessary convection flow, which helped to quickly evaporate moisture. This process was slow and required constant attention to avoid catching fire, but it was the only one available and the effect was obvious. Things were laid out on special dryers made of wood or metal, located at a safe distance from direct fire, or simply hung on ropes and poles stretched over the hearth. Fire smoke containing creosote could also have a disinfecting effect, albeit only slightly, and gave clothing a distinctive smell. If the weather allowed, things were hung out in the sun and wind to dry them naturally. Sunlight had bactericidal properties, and wind contributed to the rapid evaporation of moisture. This was the preferred method, but not always available, especially on rainy or snowy days. Vaj Owit was important to ensure good air circulation to avoid moldy conditions. Moisture from the shoes was regularly removed by changing the straw or hay padding, which absorbs sweat and water, or the shoes were simply placed by the fire to dry. Straw and hay, being excellent absorbers, not only absorbed moisture, but also provided an additional heat-insulating layer. These natural materials were readily available and relatively inexpensive, allowing farmers to change them regularly while maintaining at least some level of hygiene and foot comfort. After use, the wet straw was discarded or used as bedding for livestock, which was also part of the closed cycle of waste-free farming. Hygiene, in our modern understanding, was, to put it mildly, at a very low level. Clothes were washed very rarely, using only water and ash as a primitive soap. Ash, especially from hardwoods, contains alkali, potassium carbonate, which forms soap when combined with fats. This method, although primitive, allowed you to remove some of the dirt and grease. However, due to the rarity of washing, clothes were often dirty, greasy, and gave off a characteristic smell. This fragrance was a constant companion of the peasant, but in conditions of lack of choice and priority of survival. This was the norm, but a thick layer of dirt, grease, and natural secretions on clothing could, paradoxically, serve as additional protection from the cold and wind, creating a kind of natural armor or sealing layer. This armor trapped air, enhancing the thermal insulation properties of clothing, and served as a barrier against external influences. This was not a conscious choice, but a forced adaptation to the harsh realities where cleanliness was an impossible raskashu, and warmth was the only priority. Under such conditions, survival was far more important than appearance or smell. Winter clothing of medieval peasants was extremely functional and rarely distinguished by brightness, refinement of cut, or rich decor. Its main purpose was to provide maximum warmth, protection, and durability in the harsh conditions of everyday life and hard work. Aesthetics in the modern sense faded into the background. The colors were natural and muted. They were shades of gray, brown, beige, earthy green, and black, those that were obtained from unpainted wool and linen, or natural colors of sheep's wool. These colors were practical, as they did not get so dirty and did not require complex dyeing processes, which would have been too expensive and time-consuming. Unpainted fabrics were the most affordable and versatile, reflecting the desire for maximum resource savings. Occasionally, primitive vegetable dyes were used, extracted from local plants, oak bark, berries, leaves, which gave muted shades of green, blue, yellow, or red. For example, blue color was obtained from vita, brown color was obtained from alderbark, and reddish shades were obtained from madder. However, these dyes were unstable, faded quickly in the sun and during washing, and were available only to those who could afford the time and resources to make and use them. The dyeing process was labor-intensive, requiring large amounts of water and fuel, and was often the privilege of more affluent families or specialized artisans. The clothes were baggy, loose, and not restricting movement, which was extremely important for heavy physical labor in the field, on the farm, or in the workshop. The loose fit allowed several layers of clothing to be pulled up for extra warmth and provided the necessary ventilation, preventing overheating during operation. It would have been designed for maximum durability, as it was worn to the point of complete wear. The fabrics were dense and coarse, able to withstand constant loads and friction. Mending and remaking old clothes was commonplace and the norm of life. Patches were not a sign of poverty, but a demonstration of practicality and thrift. Every scrap of cloth was valued, and worn-out items could be sewn into children's clothing, bags, or rags for everyday use. This pragmatic approach reflected the harsh realities of their lives, where survival and practicality were far above aesthetics, fashion trends, or the desire for individuality. Things were changed, lengthened, shortened, depending on the needs of the new owner. Family members often only had 1 or 2 sets of clothing for each person, and so each item counted. Did no peasant dream of brighter colors or more comfortable and beautiful clothes? And were there any ways to stand out from the gray, monotonous mass of their neighbors without violating strict social norms? Of course we did. Human nature strives for beauty and individuality. However, living conditions dictated their own rules. Even in the face of strict functionality, austerity, and widespread monotony, farmers found ways to add a little personality to their clothing, albeit on a very modest scale. These small details were extremely valuable to them, as they allowed them to express themselves, indicate their belonging, or even demonstrate a modest well-being in a world where most things were standardized. This could be embroidery with simple geometric patterns or stylized images of plants and animals on the collars, cuffs, or bottom of clothing. These embroideries, often made with bright threads, if available, served not only as decoration, but could also carry symbolic meaning, protecting the wearer from evil spirits or attracting good luck. Patterns were often passed down from generation to generation, becoming part of the family or regional cultural heritage. Her embroidery skills were also a source of pride. Sometimes thin-colored webbing was used to trim the edges of clothing or seams made with contrasting threads. Such details, although seemingly insignificant, could noticeably enliven a modest outfit. They could be a symbol of festive clothing or indicate a special occasion. Metal buttons, if any, or simple buckles could be a small but noticeable sign of affluence or skill. Buttons, especially those made of bronze or tin, were relatively expensive and were often reused on new clothing. Simple leather or leather buttons were more common, but even these required time and skill to make. Some could afford to buy a simple clay or wooden bead at a fair or from a traveling merchant. A small brooch made of copper or tin, or an amulet that was attached to clothing, serving as a talisman and decoration. These items were not just ornaments, but often carried a deep meaning related to the beliefs, superstitions, or personal history of the owner. Talismans and amulets were an integral part of everyday life, designed to protect against diseases, failures, or evil forces. For some, a sign of luxury could be a piece of finer or better woven cloth, obtained as a result of a successful transaction, inherited from more affluent relatives or given by a lord for good service. Such a fabric, even a small fragment, could be used to make cuffs, collars, or other prominent elements of clothing, emphasizing the special position of the wearer. These small, almost imperceptible details were not only decorations, but also symbols of belonging to a particular community, a reflection of personal beliefs, and sometimes a very modest demonstration of personal well-being or the skill of a needlewoman. They served as markers of identity in a society where class differences were very strong. These small but important expressions of individuality were essential to preserve the spirit, identity, and sense of self-worth in the face of the general monotony and harsh realities of life. They were a reminder that even in a world of strict restrictions, there is room for creativity and self-expression, and that even the most modest things can have a deep personal meaning. For the medieval peasant, clothing wasn't just a set of rags to wear every day. It was a serious long-term investment and often a valuable family legacy passed down from elders to juniors. In the absence of industrial production and small-scale consumption, each item of clothing represented a significant value, comparable in importance to tools or livestock. The process of making each item required a huge amount of work, time, and resources. It began long before wool was turned into ready-made clothing. From raising and caring for sheep, shearing and carefully processing wool, to long-term spinning of threads, labor-intensive weaving of linen on primitive mills, and finally sewing the finished product by hand, using needles made of bone or metal and threads made of linen or wool. This process could take months and sometimes even years if it involved large items of clothing or preparing fabric supplies for the entire family. Therefore, the clothes were incredibly protected, repaired to the last, using every thread and every scrap, and passed down from generation to generation until they turned into rags. Every gust, every scuff was carefully sewn and darned. Patches made from pieces of old clothing were commonplace and testified to the thrift and practicality of the owners. Outerwear, such as thick wool cloaks, tunics, or jackets, could last for decades if properly cared for and regularly repaired. It has survived several generations, becoming part of our family history and passing warmth and protection from grandfathers to grandchildren. Buying a new cloth or finished product, if possible, was a serious financial event for which the peasant family prepared for a long time, saving savings, grown crops, or products of their own production. Such purchases were often timed to coincide with fairs, where you could find better prices and more diverse goods. High-quality, durable, and warm clothing was a kind of capital and vital investment that could protect the family from cold, disease, and hunger, ensuring efficiency and, as a result, survival in harsh winters. A family member's illness could lead to crop loss and starvation, so investing in health and protection from the cold was critical. This pragmatic approach stands in sharp contrast to the modern fast consumption of clothing and emphasizes the exceptional value of every stitch, every fiber in a world where resources were extremely limited and human labor was the only available capital. Clothing wasn't just a protection, it was a guarantee of life. It symbolized endurance, ingenuity, and the deep connection of man with nature and its resources. Thus, the winter clothing of medieval peasants was much more than just protection from the cold. It was a whole philosophy of survival, based on a deep understanding of natural materials, incredible ingenuity, perseverance, and pragmatism. They didn't just dress up, they created a complex, multi-layered defense system that allowed them to survive and work effectively in the harshest weather conditions, using only what nature and their own skilled hands gave them. Their wardrobe was a remarkable display of adaptability, resilience, and amazing functionality, demonstrating how, despite the extreme lack of resources and state-of-the-art technology, people found strikingly effective solutions to life's most complex challenges. Their experience and wisdom can teach us valuable lessons about thrift, functionality, and the true value of things. If you could see behind the layer of coarse cloth and the seemingly harsh lifestyle of a medieval peasant, his amazing ingenuity, fortitude, and unwavering will to survive, then this video has achieved its main goal. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed this fascinating historical excursion, and subscribe to our channels that you don't miss new, exciting, and full of unexpected discoveries, Stories about the past that will help you take a fresh look at the history of mankind.